The dress had taken Nora's mother 3 weeks to finish. She had sewn it by candlelight, after every other task in the village had been completed, after the bread was baked, after the goats were settled, after Nora's younger sister had been tucked beneath her wool blanket and kissed on the forehead. 3 weeks of careful, quiet devotion, stitching pale silver thread into cream-colored linen, adding a narrow panel of soft gray wool along the hem to give it weight and warmth. The collar was modest, the sleeves long, the cut simple, but deliberate. It was not a noblewoman's gown, but it had been made with the kind of love that no coin could purchase, and Nora wore it as though it were armor. She stood at the entrance of Coldfen Hall, the great stone keep that served as the ceremonial seat of Clan Ashvale, and breathed in slowly. The air inside was thick with the scent of burning pine resin, melted tallow from dozens of torches, and the mingled warmth of too many wolves gathered in one space. Banners hung from the vaulted ceiling, deep green and iron gray, the colors of Ashvale, and long trestle tables ran the length of the hall, crowded with pack members dressed in their finest. At the far end, a raised dais held the ceremonial bonding altar, a flat stone carved with the old markings, draped in evergreen branches and white wolf fur. Tonight was the claiming ceremony of Clan Ashvale. Tonight, Beta Corwin had promised to call her name before the altar. Nora was 23 years old, clanless by birth, the daughter of a seamstress and a woodsman who had died before she could remember his face. She had no rank, no lineage worth speaking of in a hall like this. What she had was Corwin's word, given to her 6 months ago in the quiet of the forest path behind her mother's cottage, spoken softly and with what she had believed was sincerity. "I will call your name, Nora, before the whole clan. I swear it." She had believed him. Her closest friend Petra appeared at her elbow and squeezed her arm. Petra was the daughter of Ashvale's head herbalist, which gave her just enough standing to attend tonight's ceremony without being questioned. She had warm brown skin and bright, watchful eyes, and she had known Nora since they were both children chasing rabbits through the meadows beyond the village. "You look beautiful," Petra whispered. "Your mother's work is extraordinary." Nora touched the silver embroidery at her wrist. She stayed up far too late finishing the hem. "She loves you." As she should. Petra glanced toward the dais with a slight furrow between her brows. "Corwin is already at the front. He has not looked this way." "He will." Nora kept her voice steady. "He gave me his word." Petra said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Nora moved carefully through the hall, finding a space along the right-hand wall where she could see the altar clearly without pressing too close to the clan's noble families, who occupied the front rows of carved wooden benches. She recognized several of them. Elder Voss with his iron-gray beard, the Beta families of the northern settlements, Corwin's mother and 2 aunts seated in a cluster near the dais, dressed in dark green wool and silver clasps. They did not look at Nora. They rarely did. The ceremony began with the lighting of the bonding candle, a wide pillar of white wax set at the center of the stone altar. Elder Voss spoke the traditional words, the history of the pack, the sanctity of the bond, the duty of every wolf to choose with courage and clarity. His voice carried easily through the hall. The crowd was respectful, attentive. Then came the callings. One by one, Ashvale's unbonded males stepped forward to the altar and spoke a name. Some called for women already standing at their side. Others called across the hall, and the named woman would rise and walk forward, and the crowd would murmur approvingly or fall into respectful silence depending on the match. Each bonding was witnessed and recorded by the clan scribe, who sat at a narrow table to the left of the dais with parchment and ink. Corwin was called third. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with tawny hair and the easy confidence of someone who had always belonged exactly where he stood. He stepped up to the altar, and the hall grew quiet in that particular way it always did for him. He was liked, respected, considered a fine match by most of the noble families. His mother straightened slightly on her bench, He said a name. It was not Nora's. Elise of Clan Ashvale, daughter of Elder Voss. The silence lasted only a breath before the hall broke into warm, approving murmurs. Elise was already standing, a composed young woman with dark hair and a green gown, rising from the noble benches and walking toward the altar with her chin held high. She was exactly what a beta's bonded mate was supposed to be. Ranked, lineaged, beautiful in the deliberate way of women who had been prepared for this moment their entire lives. Nora did not move. She stood with her back against the stone wall and felt the cold seep through the linen of her dress, through the careful silver stitching her mother had stayed awake to finish, through everything. The candle on the altar burned steadily. The scribe scratched his quill across the parchment. The hall applauded. Petra found her within moments. She had been watching, of course she had, and her hand came to rest on Nora's forearm. But Nora did not want comfort. Not yet. Not here, where every eye that glanced her way held a flicker of something she could not bear. Pity, or worse, quiet satisfaction. She made a decision. She would not weep in this hall. She would not make a sound. She would collect her cloak from the hook near the entrance, walk out through the great doors, and breathe the cold night air. And she would fall apart later, in private, where it belonged. She moved along the wall with measured steps. A few gazes tracked her. She kept her chin level. The hall's warmth fell away as she approached the entrance, and she reached for her cloak, a plain gray wool, nothing like the fine garments around her, and pulled it around her shoulders. She pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped into the night. The courtyard of Coldfen Hall was lit by iron braziers, their flames orange and low in the autumn wind. Beyond the keep's outer wall, the dark tree line of the forest rose against a sky full of pale stars. The air smelled of smoke and damp earth, and the faint sweetness of fallen leaves decaying in the dark. Nora stood on the stone steps and allowed herself one slow, shaking exhale. Then she heard them. Not the ceremony behind her, but voices approaching from the courtyard gate. Several men, moving with the unhurried ease of those who answer to no one. She turned without thinking, and what she saw made her still completely. 4 wolves entered the courtyard. They wore no clan colors. Their cloaks were dark, black and deep charcoal, and the quality of their leather armor was unlike anything worn by Ashvale's warriors. The first 2 walked ahead, talking quietly between themselves. One had a sharp, entertained expression. The other moved with coiled, restless energy. Behind them came a third, broad and silent, whose gaze swept the courtyard with the professional patience of a man accustomed to standing between a lord and the world. The fourth walked last. He was not the tallest of the group, though he was tall. He was not the loudest, though in the stillness of the courtyard his silence was louder than any voice. He had dark hair pulled back in braided cords that fell across one shoulder, ice-pale eyes that caught the brazier light and held it, and the kind of stillness that did not come from training. It came from certainty. He wore no crown. He needed none. Every line of his bearing announced what he was before a single word was spoken. He saw her immediately. Not the hall behind her. Not the banners through the doors. Her. His pale eyes moved over her face with an attention so focused that Nora felt it like a hand pressed flat against her sternum, not threatening, but undeniable. As though he had found something he had not expected to find, and was deciding exactly what to do about it. The sharp-faced one at the front glanced between his companion and Nora, and one corner of his mouth curved. "Well," he said quietly, to no one in particular. "That is unexpected." The silent one, the fourth, the one with the pale eyes, said nothing at all. He simply continued to look at her. And Nora, still holding the edges of her plain gray cloak, standing on the steps of a hall where she had just been quietly unmade, looked back at him and did not know what to do with the fact that for the first time all evening, she did not feel invisible. She felt seen. The sharp-faced one spoke first. as Nora had already begun to suspect was his habit. "Forgive the intrusion." He inclined his head toward her with an ease that suggested the gesture was courtesy rather than deference, the kind of bow a man gives when he is being gracious, not when he is being respectful. He had amber eyes and dark, close-cropped hair, and his cloak was fastened at the shoulder with a bronze wolf's head pin. "We were told the road to the eastern pass runs through this settlement. We appear to have arrived at an inconvenient moment." He said it pleasantly, as though the inconvenient moment were a minor social misalignment, and not a woman standing alone on stone steps in the cold, holding herself together with both hands. "The road east begins at the mill crossing," Nora said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "A quarter league past the outer gate, follow the river north until the fork, then bear right. Clear and direct." The sharp-faced one, she would learn later his name was Cale, glanced sideways at his companion with something that was nearly a smirk. "Already more useful than the last 3 villages." The second man, the restless one with coiled energy and a scar along his jaw, had been watching the hall doors with mild curiosity. He turned back now, studying Nora with open interest. His name, she would also learn later, was Brennan. He had the look of someone who found most situations entertaining and most people interesting, though not always for the same reasons. "You came from inside," Brennan said. It was not quite a question. "I did." "Claiming ceremony?" "Yes." He tilted his head. "And yet, here you are." There was no cruelty in it. It was merely an observation, stated with the frank directness of someone who did not see the point in pretending not to notice what was plainly visible. Nora met his gaze without flinching. "And yet here I am," she agreed. The fourth man had still not spoken. He had moved slightly to the left during the exchange, which placed him at a different angle from the brazier light, though it did nothing to diminish the quality of his attention. He stood with his hands at his sides, unhurried, watching her in a way that was different from the others. Cale watched with amusement. Brennan watched with curiosity. The large, quiet one, whose name she still did not know, watched with a stillness that felt almost like recognition, as though she were something he was confirming rather than discovering. Then he spoke. "Your scent carries Ashvale's resin smoke." His voice was low, unhurried, with a weight to it that had nothing to do with volume. "But not their mark." Nora blinked. "I am not of Clan Ashvale." "No." His pale eyes moved briefly, thoughtfully, as if cataloging something. "You are not." A silence settled between them. It was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that forms when 2 people are paying close attention to each other, and neither feels the need to fill the space with noise. Cale, apparently, did not share this preference. "My lord," he said with the tone of a man exercising patience, "we were traveling." "We were," the fourth man agreed, without moving his gaze from Nora. "We can wait a moment." Nora became aware, in the gradual way of someone whose attention has been fully occupied and is only now processing secondary details, that the large, quiet guard at the rear had repositioned himself. He now stood between the courtyard entrance and the group, his hand resting loosely near the short blade at his hip. Not a threat. Positioning. The kind that spoke of long practice and deep habit. These were not ordinary traveling wolves. She looked again at the man with the pale eyes, at the quality of his armor, the deliberate simplicity of it. No ornamentation, no clan colors, and yet made from materials that Ashvale's finest warriors could not have afforded. At the way the others deferred to him without appearing to, the way Cale's irreverence had a ceiling it never exceeded, the way Brennan had gone slightly still when the man spoke. "You are the Alpha King," Nora said. She had not meant to say it aloud. It arrived fully formed from somewhere between instinct and deduction, and she could not call it back. Cale made a sound that was caught halfway between a cough and a laugh. Brennan turned away entirely, facing the gate, his shoulders doing something she suspected was suppressed amusement. The Alpha King, Leander, though she did not yet know to call him that, looked at her with an expression that shifted almost imperceptibly. Not surprise. Something quieter than that. Something that looked, briefly, like satisfaction. "Most people take longer," he said. "Most people are probably not standing outside in the cold looking for something to think about other than what just happened to them," Nora replied, and then immediately wondered if she had made a catastrophic error. But the corner of his mouth moved, just barely, not quite a smile, more like the idea of one, considered and set aside for later. "Leander," he said, "my name. Nora." She pulled the cloak a little tighter, not from cold, but from a sudden need to do something with her hands. "I am nobody's, if that matters. Clanless." "It does not matter," he said, in a tone that was not comforting in the warm, hollow way of reassurance. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered as though the information were irrelevant to whatever assessment he was quietly completing. Behind her, the great oak doors of Cold Fen Hall swung open. Corwin stepped out onto the steps, Elise at his side, flushed with the warmth of the hall and new celebration. He stopped when he saw Nora. Something passed across his face. Not guilt, exactly, but an awareness of guilt that he was already in the process of rationalizing away. "Nora." His voice was careful. "I did not realize you had stepped out." "I needed air," she said. Her voice was entirely level. His eyes moved past her then, taking in the 4 men in the courtyard, and what little ease remained in his expression evaporated. Nora watched it happen, watched him process the cloaks, the bearing, the quality of the armor, and she saw the precise moment he understood. His chin dropped slightly. Beside him, Elise had gone very still. "My lord," Corwin said, stepping forward and pressing a fist to his chest in the formal greeting of a lower wolf acknowledging dominance. His voice had changed entirely, smoothed, careful, deferential. "We were not informed of your passage through Ashvale territory. Had we known, we would have prepared. We require nothing from Ashvale," Leander said. The courtesy in it was impeccable and absolute, which somehow made it more final than dismissal. "We stopped to ask for direction. The lady provided it." The lady. 2 words. Simple, unremarkable, except that they landed in the cold courtyard air like something placed deliberately. And Nora felt Corwin hear them. Felt the slight adjustment in his posture, the fractional recalibration of how he was looking at her. Cale had drifted slightly closer to Nora's left. Not close enough to be improper, close enough to be noticed. He was studying the silver embroidery at her wrist with an expression of genuine interest. "That thread work," he said quietly, pitched only for her. "Your own?" "My mother's. It follows the old knotting pattern. Ashvale doesn't use that pattern." He glanced up at her. "Neither does any clan within 3 territories of here." Nora looked at him. "She learned it from her mother, who came from far north, beyond the Greyweld." Something shifted in Cale's expression, not dramatically but enough that she noticed. He looked past her, briefly, at Leander. An unspoken thing moved between them. Leander had not taken his eyes off Nora. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them by several paces. Not quickly, not with any sense of pressure, simply with the directness of a man who saw no reason to communicate from across a courtyard when closer would do. "Where will you go tonight?" he asked. The question surprised her. Not its presumption, it carried none, but its focus. He was not asking about the ceremony, not acknowledging Corwin's presence, not performing anything for the small audience that had begun to gather at the hall doors, as curious pack members filtered out to see what had drawn the beta's attention. He was asking about her. specifically practically, with genuine interest in the answer. "Home," Nora said. "My mother's cottage, at the edge of the village." He nodded slowly. Then, after a pause that felt measured and deliberate, "You should not walk alone. Not at this hour. Not in territory without your mark on it. I have walked this road since I was a child. I know." Something moved in those pale eyes, something layered, older than this conversation. "It still matters." He looked toward his guard, the large, silent one, and something passed between them without a word being said. "Aldrich will accompany you to the village edge." It was not a command. It was not quite an offer. It existed in some third space between them. A thing decided, but gently. Nora opened her mouth to decline on principle, and found unexpectedly that she did not. She nodded once. And Leander watched her go with those pale, attentive eyes, and said nothing further. But as she turned toward the gate, she heard Cale murmur something behind her. Too low for human ears. She was not fully human. She caught 3 words. The Northern Mark. She did not yet know what they meant, but she did not forget them. Nora's mother was still awake when she arrived home. She had known she would be. Maren was the kind of woman who did not sleep when there was something worth waiting for, and tonight had been worth waiting for in every direction. Hope, then ruin. Then something entirely unnamed that Nora was still trying to arrange into a shape she could examine. The cottage was small and warm, lit by the low glow of the hearth and 2 tallow candles on the work table. The smell of it, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, wood smoke, the faint sweetness of the beeswax Maren used to condition her sewing thread, settled around Nora like a hand placed between her shoulder blades. She stood in the doorway for a moment and let herself feel it. Maren looked up from the linen she was folding. She was a slight woman with silver-streaked blonde hair and blue eyes that had always seen more than most people expected, and she read her daughter's face the way she read cloth, quickly, thoroughly, without needing to be told what to look for. She set down the linen. "Come sit," she said. Nothing else. Nora sat at the hearthside bench and told her everything. The ceremony, Corwin's voice saying Elisa's name, the walk to the door, the cold courtyard. The 4 men in dark cloaks. The Alpha King with pale eyes who had spoken to her as though she were someone whose answer mattered. Maren listened without interrupting. When Nora finished, the cottage was quiet except for the shift of settling embers. "He asked where you would go," Maren said. "Yes. Not where you lived. Not your clan. Where you would go." Nora looked at her. "Is there a difference?" "There is every difference." Maren was quiet for a moment, her hands folded in her lap, with a particular stillness that meant she was deciding something. Then she said, "The man who escorted you, the large one, did he speak?" "Aldrich? Very little. He walked me to the mill crossing and waited until I was past the gate. He said only that the road was clear and I should keep to the center of it." She paused. "And he said that his lord had good eyes." Maren made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. "Mother." Nora leaned forward. "One of the other men, Cale, he noticed your embroidery on my sleeve. He said the pattern was from beyond the Greyweld." The stillness in her mother's hands became a different kind of stillness. "Did he?" Maren said. It was not a question. "He did." And then he looked at the king as though it meant something. Nora kept her voice careful. "I have asked you before about your mother's family, about where the pattern came from." "You have. You said it was an old tradition, a northern one. You said it had no particular meaning beyond keeping the craft alive." Maren was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped softly. "I said what was safest to say," her mother replied at last. The words landed carefully, and Nora let them settle before she spoke again. Tell me what is true." Marin rose from her chair and moved to the far corner of the cottage, where an old cedar chest sat beneath a folded blanket. Nora had seen the chest her entire life, and had been told, gently, always gently, that it held her grandmother's things and was not to be opened without permission. She had respected this without resentment. It had seemed like grief, the way her mother kept that chest. She had not understood until now that it might have been something else entirely. Marin opened it. She lifted out a folded piece of cloth, older than anything else in the cottage, the fibers a deep ivory gone soft with age, and brought it to the hearth. She unfolded it carefully, and Nora leaned closer. It was a banner. Small, perhaps 2 handspans wide, the kind a noble household might hang above a doorway, rather than from a great hall ceiling. And on it, stitched in the same silver thread her mother used, in the same knotted pattern that ran along Nora's sleeve tonight, was a wolf's head. Beneath it, a single word in the old script that Nora had learned only partially from the village scribe. She sounded it out slowly. Varen. Her mother sat beside her. The Varen line, Marin said quietly, was one of the oldest Omega bloodlines in the Northern Territories, before the Great Pack Wars, before Ashvale or any of the southern clans established their boundaries. The Varens were recorded in the old histories as the founding Omegas of the Greyweld, the wolves who first held the balance between alpha dominance and pack harmony. Their bloodline carried something the histories call the still scent. Nora stared at the banner. What is the still scent? A scent that does not announce itself immediately, that settles slowly, over time, into something that cannot be ignored. In the old records, it was considered a mark of ancient blood, a sign that a wolf carries something deeper than rank. Marin folded her hands. Most alpha wolves cannot detect it at a distance, but a wolf of sufficient dominance, of the right bloodline himself, can sense it even when it is suppressed. The quiet of the cottage pressed in around them. He smelled it, Nora said. Not a question this time. I suspect, her mother said carefully, that the Alpha King did not come through Ashvale by chance. By morning, the news had reached the village like water through cracked stone, slowly, then all at once. The Alpha King's party had not continued east. They had taken lodging at the Stone Way House beyond the mill crossing, the largest and most defensible building in the settlement, and Leander had sent word to Clan Ashvale's elder, requesting a formal audience. The message, as Elder Voss reported it to his council in tones of barely controlled anxiety, contained 3 items: a greeting, a request to review the clan's territorial records from the past 40 years, and a secondary note, brief, specific, asking that the clanless woman named Nora be present for the meeting. Petra arrived at the cottage before Nora had finished her morning bread. The whole pack is talking, she said, slightly breathless, settling onto the bench and pulling her cloak off her shoulders. Corwin's mother is apparently furious, though no one is certain at what exactly. Elder Voss sent 2 messengers to the Way House already, and Corwin himself. She paused, clearly choosing her words. He came by the herbalists this morning, asking my father whether he knew anything about your family's origins. Nora set down her bread. What did your father say? That you were Marin's daughter and a good neighbor, and he had no idea what Corwin was talking about. Petra tilted her head. Which is more or less true, yes? It was, Nora said, until last night. She told Petra what her mother had told her. Petra listened with the focused silence of someone who understood that this was not the moment for exclamations, who grasped instinctively that what she was being told was both precious and delicate, and that the right response was to receive it carefully. When Nora finished, Petra was quiet for a moment. Then, the Alpha King asked for you specifically, by name. Yes. He learned your name in a courtyard conversation that lasted perhaps a quarter hour. Less. Petra looked at her steadily. Nora, that is not something a king does without reason. I know. What will you do? Nora was quiet. Through the cottage window, the gray morning light fell across the hearth and the cedar chest her mother had left unlocked for the first time in Nora's memory. The small banner was folded back inside it, but Nora could picture it clearly. The silver wolf, the old word, the knotwork that matched her sleeve. I will go to the meeting, she said. The Wayhouse Hall was smaller than Coldfen's great keep, but more solid, built from river stone with deep-set windows and a long central table that had clearly been cleared and reset for the occasion. Elder Voss sat at one end with two of his senior advisors. Corwin was present as well, though he had taken a seat at the far edge of the bench in a posture that was attempting dignity and achieving something closer to tension. Leander sat at the opposite end of the table. He looked exactly as he had in the courtyard, unhurried, settled, occupying his chair with the ease of a man who was comfortable in any room he entered, because he understood that the room's character was ultimately defined by whoever held the most authority within it. Cale was at his right. Brennan leaned against the wall to the left, arms crossed, watching everything. Aldrich stood behind the king's chair. When Nora entered, every head in the room turned. Leander's did not. He had been watching the door before she opened it. She took the seat Elder Voss indicated, midway down the table, neutral ground, and folded her hands and waited. We are grateful for your presence, my lord, Elder Voss began, in the tone of a man who was grateful in the way one is grateful for weather that has not yet turned violent. We were not aware that Ashvile's records were of interest to the crown. They were not, until recently. Leander's voice carried the same unhurried weight it had held in the courtyard. I am looking for a specific lineage marker in the northern pack records. A bloodline that was recorded in Greyweld histories is dispersed southward during the pack wars. My scholars traced several branches as far as Ashvile's old territorial boundaries. Elder Voss shifted. And you believe this lineage is present in our clan? No, Leander said. He looked for the first time since Nora had entered, directly at her. I believe it is present in this room. The silence that followed was the kind that changes a space permanently, the way a stone dropped in still water changes the surface even after the ripple fades. Corwin's head turned sharply toward her. Nora held the king's gaze and did not look away. The Varenne bloodline, Leander said, addressing the table but watching her, does not follow pack structure. It follows maternal descent and surfaces unpredictably across generations. The still scent that marks it is identifiable only under specific conditions. He paused. I have been searching for its living carriers for 4 years. Why? Nora asked. The directness of it landed in the room without apology. Cale's expression flickered. Not displeasure, something closer to approval. Brennan, against the wall, went very still. Leander looked at her for a moment that felt longer than it was. Because the Varenne line carries a gift the crown has needed for a very long time, he said. And because the last carrier I found was your grandmother, who died without telling anyone what she carried, except it seems through thread and pattern and a small banner kept in a cedar chest. Nora's breath was steady. Her hands were steady. Every other part of her was trying to understand what it meant that a king had spent 4 years looking for something that had been sitting in her mother's cottage the entire time. What is the gift? She asked. Leander was quiet for one deliberate moment. The ability to stand in the center of a pack at war, he said, and make them remember why they chose each other. The meeting ended without resolution, which Nora suspected was deliberate. Leander did not press. He did not lay out demands or make proclamations. He reviewed the territorial records Elder Voss provided, asked 3 precise questions about the northern boundary markers from 40 years prior, and thanked the elder with the same impeccable courtesy he had used in the courtyard. the kind that left no room for complaint and no leverage for negotiation. Then he closed the matter as though he were closing a book, and the audience was finished. But before Nora rose from the table, he spoke to her directly, and only to her. "Walk with me." It was not phrased as a command. It was not quite an invitation either. It existed in that same third space as his offer the night before, a thing proposed by someone who was accustomed to being followed, but who was, for reasons she did not yet fully understand, choosing to ask. She walked with him. The morning had cleared slightly, the low gray cloud pulling back to reveal a pale sky above the tree line. The way house had a narrow yard behind it, bordered by a stone wall and an old rowan tree that had dropped most of its leaves, a few red berries still clinging to the branches. Leander walked at an easy pace along the wall, his hands behind his back, and said nothing for long enough that Nora began to suspect the silence was itself part of what he was doing. "You are not afraid of me," he said finally. "Should I be?" He considered this with apparent sincerity. "Most people are. Not because I have given them reason, because of what I represent." "Power makes people afraid," Nora agreed, "but you have not pointed it at me." He glanced at her sideways. "No. Then there is nothing to be afraid of yet." The corner of his mouth moved in that same way it had the night before, the idea of a smile, considered. "You said yet. I am practical." They walked a few paces in silence. The rowan's remaining berries caught the pale light, impossibly red against the gray stone wall. "The Varen gift," Nora said. "You described it as the ability to stand at the center of a pack at war and make them remember why they chose each other." She paused. "That sounds less like a power and more like a responsibility." "All real power is responsibility," he said. "The ones who forget that are the dangerous ones." She looked at him. "Is that why you are searching for it? Because your pack is at war?" The word war sat between them plainly. He did not flinch from it. "Not yet," he said. "But the northern territories have been fracturing for 2 years. 3 clans that shared a border for generations are now building separate fortifications and refusing the joint winter councils. Old alliances are collapsing over land disputes that should have been resolved through mediation, but have instead been allowed to fester." He stopped walking. He looked at the rowan tree, its bare branches, its stubborn remaining berries. "I can enforce peace through authority. I have done it. But authority without understanding only holds as long as the fear does, and fear is an exhausting foundation." "You want something that lasts," Nora said. "I want something true." He turned to look at her. "The Varen gift, as the old records describe it, is not magic in the way people imagine, not a force that overrides will. It is a quality of presence, a stillness that allows others to be heard. The still scent is merely the physical marker. The actual gift is the capacity to hold a space where honesty becomes possible." He watched her carefully. "You do not seem surprised by this." "I am trying to decide," she said slowly, "whether what you are describing matches anything I have experienced, or whether I have simply been told it matches and am now searching my own history for confirmation." Leander was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is exactly the right question to ask. It is also not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It is not." He resumed walking, and she fell into step beside him. "I am not asking you to accept what I have told you as truth. I am asking you to consider it. There is a gathering of the fractured northern clans in 30 days, at the border fortress of Carmalt. Every clan leader will be present, including the 3 who have been building walls where bridges used to stand. I have been trying to find a way to hold that gathering that does not begin in posturing and end in drawn blades." He paused. "I believe your presence would change the character of that room." Nora stopped walking. She turned to face him fully, and he stopped as well, and they stood in the narrow yard with the rowan tree beside them and the pale sky above, and she looked at him with the directness that had apparently become her primary mode of existing in this conversation. "You are asking me to come to Carmalt," she said. "I am." "As what?" The question was precise, and he received it as such. "As yourself," he said, "under the Crown's protection, with your status formally recognized as a carrier of the Varenne line, which under the old charter grants you standing before any pack council regardless of clan affiliation." Nora absorbed this. "And if I say no?" "Then you say no," he said simply. "I will not compel you. That would defeat every purpose." She studied his face. It was a composed face, not unreadable exactly, but disciplined, the way a man's face becomes when he has learned that expressions are things with consequences, and has spent years learning to choose them carefully. But beneath the composure, there was something else, something she was beginning to recognize, the quality of someone who was genuinely paying attention, not performing attention, actually present. "There is something else you have not said," she told him. A pause. "Yes." "Say it." He held her gaze. "The still scent is detectable only under specific conditions. One of those conditions is proximity to a wolf of matching blood resonance, a dominant line of sufficient age and depth." He was very still. "I have been searching for the Varenne carrier for 4 years. I found you within moments of entering this settlement. A breath. That is not coincidence, Nora. It is recognition." The word landed between them softly, but it had weight. She understood what he was not saying directly, was choosing not to say, giving her the space to arrive at it herself. The resonance between a dominant bloodline and the Varenne gift was not merely practical. The old records, she suspected, would say more about it than he had chosen to share in the first hour of their acquaintance. She respected that he had not said it. She also noted that he had come close enough that she could, when she was ready, find the rest herself. Petra's reaction, when Nora returned to the cottage and told her everything, was to sit very quietly for approximately 4 seconds, and then say, "I knew Corwin was going to ruin everything, and I should have told you so 6 months ago." "That is not the relevant part of what I just told you," Nora said. "It is extremely relevant. It establishes that my instincts are sound, and you should listen to me going forward." Petra looked at her steadily. "Are you going to go? To Carmalt?" "I don't know yet." "What does your mother say?" Nora glanced toward the back room, where Marin had been uncharacteristically quiet since Nora's return. "She has not said much. She opened the cedar chest again and has been looking at things inside it." Petra was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, "Do you trust him?" Nora considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She thought about Leander in the courtyard, the way he had looked at her first, before the hall, before Corwin, before any of the context that should have shaped his attention. She thought about the meeting table, the direct answer to a direct question. She thought about the yard and the rowan tree, and the thing he had chosen not to say yet. "I trust that he is telling the truth about what he wants," she said finally. "I trust that his reasons are genuine. I do not yet trust that I understand all of them." She looked at Petra. "But I have spent 6 months trusting a man who told me comfortable things and meant none of them. I think I would rather be uncertain with someone honest than certain with someone who is not." Petra nodded slowly. "Then you are going." "I think I am going." She went to speak to Leander once more before evening fell. She found him in the Wayhouse's small reading room, an alcove off the main hall with a narrow table, a 3-branched candle holder, and a collection of the Wayhouse's few bound volumes, none of which he appeared to be reading. He was standing at the window, looking out at the tree line, and turned when she entered without apparent surprise. "I will come to Carmalt," she said, "under the conditions you described. My status formally recognized. The crown's protection extended in writing, witnessed by Elder Voss. Agreed. And I want Petra, my companion, included in the travel party. She is the daughter of Ashvale's herbalist and a capable woman. I will not go without her. Something in his expression shifted. Not resistance, something warmer than that. Approval, perhaps, of the specific shape of her conditions. Agreed, he said again. She nodded once, completing the arrangement. Then, because she was practical, and because she had decided to be honest with herself about what she had felt, standing in a cold courtyard the night before. The thing you chose not to say this morning, about what the old records say happens between the Varenne line and its resonant match. Leander looked at her. I will find it myself, she said. I would rather read it than be told it. But I wanted you to know that I am aware it exists. A pause, longer than his pauses usually were. The Way House has a copy of the Greyweld Chronicle, he said. Third shelf. The binding is dark green. The pages are loose in the back. The relevant passage is in the 7th chapter. She held his gaze for one moment. Then she turned and went to find the book. Behind her, she heard nothing. No movement, no sound. But she had the absolute, inexplicable certainty that he was smiling. Not the idea of one this time, the real thing. The Greyweld Chronicle was exactly where he said it would be. Nora sat at the narrow table in the reading alcove with the candles burning low, and the Way House quiet around her, and she read the 7th chapter twice. The language was old, the phrasing formal in the way of scholars who believed clarity was a virtue and brevity was not, but the meaning was plain enough once she settled into the rhythm of it. The Varenne line, the chronicle recorded, did not produce its gift in isolation. The still scent was indeed a marker, a signal carried in the blood that announced, to those with the sensitivity to perceive it, the presence of something rare. But the gift itself, the capacity for presence that allowed fractured wolves to remember their wholeness, was not a solitary power. It was a paired one. The old writers described it with the term resonant bond, a connection between the Varenne carrier and a dominant wolf of deep bloodline, through which the gift was stabilized and magnified. Without the resonant bond, the Varenne carrier functioned quietly, a steadying presence felt but rarely understood. With it, the gift became something the chronicle described, with the unself-conscious grandeur of old scholarship, as the hearth at the center of the kingdom. Not a tool, not a weapon, a home. Nora closed the book and sat with her hands flat on the table and breathed slowly. She was not afraid. She examined herself for fear, and found instead something more complicated. The sensation of standing on ground that had always been solid, but that she had not, until now, known was solid. The difference between safety assumed and safety confirmed. She thought of her mother sewing silver thread by candlelight. She thought of a banner and a cedar chest. She thought of a man in a dark courtyard who had looked at her first, before anything else, and had not looked away. She put the chronicle back on the 3rd shelf, spine outward, and went to find her mother. Maren was sitting beside the open cedar chest when Nora returned to the cottage. She had taken out the small banner and smoothed it across her knees, and she was looking at it with an expression Nora had never seen on her face before. Not grief, not fear, but something resolving. The expression of a woman setting down a weight she had carried for a very long time. Nora sat beside her. "You knew he would come eventually," she said. "I hoped." Maren touched the silver wolf on the banner. "Your grandmother told me that the bloodline would be found when the kingdom needed it. I did not know if that meant my lifetime or yours or your daughter's. I only knew to keep the pattern alive." She looked up at her daughter. "I am sorry I kept it from you so long." "You kept us safe," Nora said. "That is not something to apologize for." They sat together for a while in the warmth of the hearth. Then Maren folded the banner carefully and placed it in Nora's hands. "Take it with you," she said. It belongs with you now. It always did. The journey to Carmalt took 9 days. They traveled as a compact party. Leander and his 3 companions, Nora and Petra, and a small escort of 6 crown riders who maintained a respectful distance and spoke little. The roads were dry and cold, running through forest and open moorland, past small settlements where people came to their doorways to watch the king's banner pass. Nora had expected the journey to be formal, perhaps even uncomfortable. The careful navigation of proximity between a clanless Omega and a king, freighted with protocol and observation. It was not. Leander rode at the front of the party in the mornings and fell back beside her in the afternoons without ceremony, and they talked about the territories they passed through, about the history recorded in the chronicle, about the 3 fractured northern clans and what she needed to understand about their grievances before she entered any room with them. He did not tell her what to do. He shared information and trusted her to form her own conclusions. It was, she discovered, deeply characteristic of him. Cale rode beside Petra with increasing frequency as the days passed, which Petra pretended not to notice, and which fooled no one. Brennan told stories at the evening fire that were almost certainly embellished and entirely entertaining. Aldrich remained large and quiet and reliable, and Nora developed a genuine affection for his steadiness. On the 5th evening, camped at the edge of a pine forest with the fire burning high and the stars very bright and close, Leander sat beside her after the others had settled and said, "You read the chronicle." "I did." "And?" She looked at the fire. "And I understand why you did not tell me directly. It would have been a great deal to absorb in a courtyard at night after an already considerable evening." He was quiet for a moment. "It would have been presumptuous." "Yes." She glanced at him. "You are not a presumptuous man." "I try not to be." The fire shifted, throwing light across the angles of his face, the strong line of his jaw, the pale eyes that caught reflected flame and held it. He was looking at the fire too, giving her the same space he always gave her. And she thought about what the chronicle had called the resonant bond, and about what it meant that she had been sitting beside him for 5 days and felt, continuously and without drama, exactly like herself. Not diminished, not overwhelmed, not performed. Herself. "Leander," she said. He turned. "I am not afraid of what the chronicle says," she told him. "I want you to know that. I am not running toward it blindly either, but I am not afraid of it." He looked at her for a long, still moment. Then he said quietly, "Neither am I." Carmalt was a fortress built at the convergence of 3 rivers, its gray stone walls rising from a natural promontory above the water. It was formidable, ancient, and entirely suited to the purpose of hosting wolves who did not entirely trust each other. The clan leaders arrived on the same day as Leander's party, which Nora suspected was not coincidence, the timing arranged so that no single clan could claim the fortress first, and set the terms of the gathering by occupying it. The 3 fractured clans, Veth, Duncarrow, and Sable Reach, arrived within hours of each other, their parties maintaining careful distances in the fortress yard, their leaders greeting Leander with the formal deference owed to the crown, and eyeing each other with the banked hostility of long grievance. They looked at Nora with open curiosity. A clanless woman, traveling under the king's banner, formally introduced by Leander as a carrier of the Varenne line. The name landed differently depending on who heard it. The older clan members went still with recognition. The younger ones looked uncertain, and all of them recalculated something. Corwin was not there. He would never be there, in any room that mattered. Nora found, when she examined the thought, that it produced nothing in her, not satisfaction, not residual pain, simply the quiet acknowledgement of a chapter fully closed. The formal council began the following morning. Nora did not speak first. She sat at the long stone table in the great hall of Carmalt and listened, genuinely listened, with the full attention she had always given to things worth understanding. as the clan leaders spoke. She heard the land dispute beneath Veth's formal complaint. She heard the fear beneath Duncaro's aggression. She heard Sable Reach's loneliness disguised as pride. She let the room fill with all of it, and she did not rush it, and she did not fix it prematurely. When there was a silence, the dangerous kind, the kind that precedes men reaching for grievances because there is nothing else to hold, she spoke. She did not give a speech. She asked a question. A single specific question directed at the Veth clan leader about a particular stretch of river boundary. A question that demonstrated she had listened to every word he had said and understood what it actually meant beneath the formal language. He answered her. At length. With the particular relief of a man who has been trying to be heard for 2 years and has finally been heard. And then the other 2 clan leaders, almost without realizing it, began answering her as well. Leander sat at the head of the table and said very little for the next 3 hours. Cale, at his right, watched Nora with an expression of focused respect. Brennan had stopped leaning against the wall and was sitting upright. By the end of the day, Veth and Duncaro had agreed to a joint survey of the disputed boundary, to be conducted in the presence of a crown mediator. Sable Reach had accepted an invitation to the Winter Council they had refused for 2 years. No blade had been drawn. No voice had been raised beyond the volume of honest frustration. It was not magic. It was not a single gift deployed in a single moment. It was presence. Patient, genuine, unhurried presence, offered consistently until the room remembered what it felt like to be a room where honesty was possible. 3 months after Carmalt, in the great hall of the crown seat at Veldrath, Leander formally recognized the Varan line as a protected bloodline under Crown Charter, with all rights and standing the old law provided. Nora stood before the assembled nobles and pack representatives in a gown of deep blue wool with silver embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Her mother's work, finished the week before, the knotwork pattern precise and deliberate, and entirely itself. Marin was in the hall. Petra stood at Nora's left. Aldrich stood behind the king's chair, as he always did. After the formal recognition, when the hall had settled into the warmth of the gathering, wine and firelight, and the particular ease of wolves who were, for the moment, at peace, Leander came to stand beside her at the long window that overlooked Veldrath's inner courtyard. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches when a quiet moment would do. He offered her his hand, palm upward, unhurried. A question in the form of an open gesture. She looked at it for one breath. Then she placed her hand in his. Outside the window, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall. Soft, unhurried, settling on the stones of the courtyard, and the bare branches of the trees, and the crown banners that hung from the fortress walls, covering everything evenly, the way peace covers a landscape when it finally arrives, without drama, without announcement, as though it had always been there waiting to be allowed. Marin, watching from across the hall, said nothing. She simply touched the silver knotwork at her own sleeve and allowed herself at last to stop waiting. Petra, beside her, reached over and squeezed her hand. Cale, across the room, appeared to be telling Brennan something that made Brennan laugh. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind that belongs to men who have found their way home. Aldrich, behind the king's chair, looked at nothing in particular with the expression of a man who was entirely satisfied with how things had concluded. And Nora stood at the window with her hand in Leander's, and looked out at the falling snow, and felt, without qualification or condition, that she belonged exactly where she was. Not because she had been chosen, not because she had been found, or recognized or named, because she had chosen. Eyes open, hands steady, afraid of nothing worth being afraid of. The snow fell on, the hall stayed warm, and the story, at last, was complete.